how my email server would be configured. So going back to the MOST designer, I'm going to go to the menu under Data and Global Variables. And these are variables specific to each of the workflows. We try and prefix them with a specific word or phrase so that we know what they're related to. And you'll notice there's a handful of variables related to the email server. And different settings are required depending on the type of server you plan on using. So by default, the Exchange server type is set to 2007 to 2013. And down at the bottom, once we selected a variable, we could see what options are available for it. Some of the variables will have a drop-down to kind of help you or help guide you to selecting the correct option, while others will display just a text box that you can manually enter information into. So the first thing to determine with setting up an email server is what type of email server do you plan on using? Will it be SMTP, Exchange 2003, Exchange 2007 to 2013, or any version in between there, or Exchange for Office 365? What I'm going to try and use is SMTP. So once I select the value, I'm going to hit Update, and you'll see the variable for that setting changes. You'll also notice up at the top where it says Global Variables, put a little asterisk next to it on this tab, kind of indicating that a change was made that hasn't been saved yet. Now, because I chose SMTP, some additional settings are required that aren't typically required with Exchange. The email server name is probably the next one in the list that needs to be configured. When using Exchange, the email server name is automatically determined based on the Active Directory setup. With SMTP, however, we need to manually specify the email server name. Now, my email server, I'm going to use an IP address. A name or IP address will work for the server name. The other settings corresponding to SMTP are the email port and email SSL enabled. The email port by default is 25, and I believe that should work with my environment. And SSL enabled is optional, and this will depend on the email server whether it requires SSL or not. I'm going to update this. I don't believe mine requires SSL. Email to self, although it looks like a variable that you may want to adjust, it's actually used for some of the screen configuration. So we're going to leave that option alone. And then we have email username and email user password, which are, again, used for SMTP. Some email servers will require a username and password to send through the SMTP server. In my case, I don't believe I require one. So I'm going to save my global variable changes. And it looks like I had also made changes to collections earlier, but I'm not going to save those. So now that I've made my changes, and I give the system a few seconds to recognize that I made changes, I'm going to log out and log back into MOST Desktop to make sure that it recognizes those changes as well. And I'm going to enter an email address. And I'm going to scan just like I did with the scan to folder. And once the preview is displayed, I'll hit finish. And if I've configured everything properly, hopefully we get a successful status here. And similar to the scan to folder screen, the email status is set up to refresh on a set interval. So it does, or it could take a few seconds before it appears, but like we see here, it does say that it was a successful scan to email. So I did have all the correct information. If I didn't have the correct information, I would have seen a failed message here under the status. And I'd also see in the Windows event log error messages corresponding to the failure that will hopefully help me troubleshoot and determine what had actually gone wrong.